All right, welcome back. So to begin this lecture and building off what we talked about in the previous lecture, let's just stop for a minute. Now let's think about how inflation might impact the labor market. So with inflation and with high levels of inflation, will people be more willing or less willing to work? Do we think firms are going to want more workers or fewer workers? Okay, so let's look at this. On the left, the figure on the bottom of the screen, the left one of those, is our labor market in equilibrium. Now, if we consider an increase in the prices that consumers are going to pay, it's going to shift the supply curve to the left or decrease the supply of workers. Because each dollar that workers receive in their salary are able to buy fewer goods, and every non-Scrooge person out there wants money to buy things, not just to have the money. Workers are going to have a higher reservation wage. It's going to take them more money to get them to work in that profession. This means that at each price, in this case, each wage, fewer workers are going to be willing and able to work. Now, leisure or sitting out of work for other reasons will be less costly because they're giving up less money to do so. At the same time, labor demand is going to shift to the right. It's actually going to increase at every wage. This might be a little more unintuitive than the supply curve. The reason why the demand curve is going to shift to the right, or demand is going to increase, is that the marginal production of each worker increases when the price of goods increases. So firm gets more money per worker because people are paying more for those goods. Because now each worker is making more money for the firm, firms are going to be willing and able to hire more. So here on the right is showing that phenomenon happen. We have the supply curve shifting to the left, and we have the demand curve shifting to the right. Now, how far the supply and demand curves shift is going to depend on the change in consumer prices and the change in producer prices. So the demand curve is going to be dependent on producer prices, how much it's going to cost producers to actually put the materials they need to make those goods. Now, they can be the same or they can differ. And this example I created so that the consumer prices increase a little bit more than the producer prices, but this doesn't have to be the case. If the producer prices increase more than the consumer prices, then we would see the opposite effect, on the quantity of labor in this new equilibrium. It would actually increase instead of decrease. So we say that inflation will have an ambiguous effect on workers because it depends on which one of those curves moves more. On the other hand, no matter what, wages are going to increase. I'm not going to make you work a lot with two curves shifting at the same time because typically what we see is one of the effects is going to be ambiguous. But when there is inflation in labor markets, we can expect wages to increase. And without more information, without knowing the relative increase in prices, we can't say what the effect is going to be on the number of workers. So the next section in your textbook is about the Phillips curve. I'm going to skip that because we're not teaching fiction, and we're going to move straight on to equilibrium across different labor markets. So right here, what is, we have an example. So what is behind the difference here between the teacher in Boise, Idaho, and the software engineer in Boston, Massachusetts? So the teacher in Boise, Idaho is making on average $51,000. I think that was last year's number. And software engineers in Boston, Massachusetts, on average, make about $120,000. And that changes depending on exactly how you define software engineer. So this is a pretty big difference. A teacher in Boise could learn how to code, move to Boston, and make 70K more. So why does this exist? Well, we think if a lot of people did this, we would see the wages offered to entice teachers to stay in Boise, Idaho, slowly start to increase. They need to offer them more and more to convince them to stay instead of going to school and then moving across the country. At the same time, if a lot of people moved from areas where it was cheap, whether we're looking at just teachers in Boise, Idaho, or across the country and all different professions across the country, we'll start to see the wages at software engineers creep down as more and more workers are willing to work in this industry. So let's look at two labor markets, which are cleverly named labor market A and labor market B. And we'll look at the supply and demand for a single profession within those markets. In this case, the only difference between those two markets is the location. So the workers themselves and the jobs are exactly the same. They have all the same characteristics on average. So if we saw a wage differential like this, in market A, the average wage that workers are making is $9 an hour. In market B, it's only $8 an hour. So we have this $1 difference between the two markets. So typically, if wage earners in market A are earning more, we would expect some workers from market B to migrate to market A. And what this would do is end up driving down the wage in market A and driving up the wage in market B. Because in market A, we end up increasing the supply of workers. That's going to shift the supply curve to the right. And we're going to see the move, if we look at the bottom part of the panel, it's for market A, the move from S1 to S2. So where S2, this new increase supply curve, where that crosses the demand curve, is going to be at a lower point. In this case, it's at $8.25. At the same time, in labor market B, because we have people leaving the labor market, they're now moving to market A. That's going to shift the supply curve to the left. Now, where this new supply curve S2 crosses the demand curve is going to be at a slightly higher point. Again, we're in this example, we're moving towards the same price until they're exactly the same. So imagine this is like two cities next door where it's pretty cheap to move from one city to another. In this case, it's also moving to $8.25. So eventually we settle at a point where both labor market A and labor market B have the same wages that they're paying employees. But what if there's something else going on? So let's look at another example. It could be that labor market A and B are in the same physical location. The difference between those two markets is market A is for higher skilled employees in this specific industry, and labor market B is for lower skilled employees in this same specific industry. If that's the case, then workers in market B are going to have an incentive not to move this time. Now it's an incentive to build their skills or develop human capital, as economists would say. So we'd see the same thing play out. We would see workers leave market B for market A. Now they're doing it through building skills or undergoing formal education or getting like on-the-job training certificates. That's going to decrease the supply of workers in market B and increase the supply of increase the supply of workers in market A. And we're going to drive them towards the same wage. Now, in both of these cases, are we likely to see the same wage in both markets? This is highly unlikely to occur. And it depends on the differences between those markets. There's going to be a cost for any adjustment. So whether it's moving to a new city or education in our two examples. As long as the cost of moving or the cost of education is lower than the wage difference for moving, people are going to move. If there's some gain to be had in excess of the cost of whatever that move is going to be. And people are going to move from one labor market to the other, and whether it's education or physically moving, until the cost of moving, or the cost of education, the cost of going from that one labor market to the other is equal to the wage increase that they get. So in the long run, we can see wage differences persist between locations in the same industry or between skill levels within the same industry. Now, sometimes, like your text goes into this in a little bit more depth, there's a skill that's so rare, something like pro athlete or CEO, that people are unable to just enter the market. And they don't really bring down the average wage. We don't see the wage falling like we do from the higher skill, the market A here. I can't just decide one day to be a good enough basketball player to guard Nikola Jokic, or I can't replace Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase. I can't just decide to be skilled enough to do that. It takes a very specific skill set. For basketball, it takes physical attributes, something that most people just can't do. So when these large wage differentials persist, and in these extreme cases I gave out, they persist and they're quite large, we refer to these as economic rents. So it's not just the workers who can change their willingness and ability to work, or where they're working, what market they're in, due to differentials in wages. Firms also react to that. so they can shift their labor demand. So we've seen this in the past with outsourcing over the last few decades, moving from production from, the United States to other countries where the cost of production is lower. But it's much older than that. So in the early 1900s, a lot of textile manufacturers moved south from New England to the southern US states because the workers in New England were relatively highly paid, especially compared to workers in the South who were more or paid less per hour. Because low-skilled workers command lower wages than higher-skilled workers, companies do have an incentive to try to figure out how to use lower-skilled employees in production. So here in the figures on the slide, we can see how changes in demand can reduce or eliminate wage disparities. So is the demand for low-wage workers, so that's market B, while market A is the market for high-skilled workers. So as the demand for low-wage workers increases in market B, so we shift the demand curve from D to D2, it's going to increase the wage that they command. And it's going to increase the number of low-skilled employees that are able to find work at that wage. At the same time, firms are going to demand few higher-skilled workers. So their wages are going to fall, and then the demand curve is going to shift to the left. We see fewer higher-skilled workers being demanded by firms. Now, in the long run, this adjustment process depends on the ability for firms to substitute lower skilled workers for higher skilled workers. Now, it's not going to, like we see in this example, perfectly even out where the lower skilled workers have the same exact wage as the higher skilled workers. In practice, there's only so much substitution that firms can do for these lower skilled workers for higher skilled workers. So we don't expect adjustments in demand to completely eliminate the disparity in wages between these markets, A and B, in this case for higher versus lower skilled workers. But we may see it in some cases, like if we're looking at two nearby labor markets with slightly different costs of living. Over time, changes in demand may be able to completely eliminate the wage differential. But typically, especially if we're looking at things like skill-based wage differentials, we're not going to see enough changes in supply or demand to be able to completely take care of those, completely eliminate them. Although adjustments in supply or demand, by adjustments shifting the supply and demand curves, as we see graphically, although it can reduce the wage differences between markets, again, they're not often going to be enough to eliminate the differences between them. In the long run, we still experience a difference in wages between these markets, whether these markets are based on the skill of the employee, the education that they receive, the danger of the job, or other characteristics. But these differences, if there's difference in the long run between the wages, odds are there's some characteristics of the jobs that are different enough that employees need to be compensated to work in these different jobs. So it may be that, for instance, salaries are higher in a place like Washington, D.C. than in a more rural place like Morgantown, West Virginia, or Altoona, Pennsylvania, for the same exact job or a very similar job. But this difference is going to be caused by the difference in the cost of living. That's much more expensive to live in Washington, D.C. than it is to live in, a place like Morgantown. We call this compensating differentials. So basically the additional amount of income that a given worker must be offered in order to motivate them to accept a given undesirable job relative to jobs that other workers could perform. So we typically use this concept for undesirable jobs. That's the definition typically is. It can also speak of compensating differentials for a desirable job, so something that provides some sort of special benefits. If this is the case, workers are actually going to be paid less than a job with similar characteristics. Maybe it's things like the prestige associated with a job. Maybe it's flexible working hours that employees really appreciate, but they're actually willing to be paid less in order to get this job. But typically we think of it as a tough job, like I have the picture here of Micro from Dirty Jobs, something that's either dangerous or something that people really don't like to do. They have to be paid more money to do it than just the characteristics of the job, like the education required, the skill level, how much money they actually bring in to the company, so the marginal revenue that they produce. So because of the cost of higher education, jobs that require specialized training that the employee has to pay for themselves are typically rewarded with higher wages. Again, because it's more expensive for the employee to pay to develop the skills that they need for that job, they end up being paid more for that job. They have to be compensated for that. And because all of economics is basically just a footnote to Adam Smith, who started off the field basically in 1776, he has an explanation for compensating differentials from way back when that still holds up today. And your textbook goes through and lists some of the examples Adam Smith actually gave in The Wealth of Nations about why compensating differentials exist in different situations where they do. So there has been some empirical work studying wage differentials. Your textbook has a section on that. This is the last thing we'll cover in chapter 7. So there are some interregional wage differentials, and the basic findings of the research, what's tended to find over the years, is that net in-migration, so migration into an area, is positively correlated with relative wages in a region. So people tend to move more to areas with higher wages. They move less to areas with lower wages. A net in-migration is negatively correlated with the unemployment rate. So if there's excess workers there that can be pulled out and enter the labor force if wages start to rise, there's a lot of those people around. People are less likely to move to the area as well. And finally, net in-migration is negatively correlated with the cost of moving. So it's more expensive to move somewhere, fewer people are going to go there. Again, the wage differential in the high cost of moving area has to be that much higher than other places to get people to be willing to move there. And all three of these findings are consistent with the model we talked about. Now, the other aspect that that textbook really looks into is job safety. So differences in wages should compensate for non-wage characteristics of the job. In this case, they're looking at job safety, but there's a lot of other negative things. There could be negative, like a stigma associated with a job, or tends to have, I guess, lower status in the eyes of other people. Now, the jobs, you will need to pay workers more money to be willing to go into those jobs. So now, hedonic wage functions are basically the assumption that employees maximize their utility in job selection, outlined by the labor market. So basically, what that means in normal language is that the more undesirable a job is, the higher wages and employees are going to need to be compensated for working at that company. And what we tend to find is that workers in jobs with a higher risk of injury or death earn a premium of similar jobs without that high risk of injury or death.